Welcome back. In this video, we're going to set up our first project in Android Studio. After having installed Android Studio and set it up correctly in the last video, now it's time to really get our first project ready. Before we then will look at how the user interface of Android Studio looks like in the next video. So this video is really just to give you a better understanding of the different options that you have available when starting and creating your first project in Android Studio. All right, we're not going to go too much into depth here, but I will give you a little bit of a background as we go. All right, let's get started. I'm inside of the Android Studio that we set up last time. I'm greeted here where it says welcome to Android Studio, and that is because I have no project opened or installed on this machine so far. And before we go into creating a new project, you can see that you can customize your installation. For example, here you can change the color theme. I'm using the dark theme so that it's all a little darker and better on the eyes. I'm using the IDE font size of 13, and I use the key map of Windows, which is the default setting, at least in my case it was. Now you can make changes here, but I would just recommend to really follow along exactly with the same settings as I do. Then inside of plugins, you can see that there are some plugins that I can get from the marketplace. Plugins are basically extensions for our Android Studio installation that make developing certain applications easier. So we won't need that until quite a bit later, but it's going to be useful at some point. All right, so I'm not going to go into too much depth at this point. There are some plugins installed by default. As you can see, I have a bunch of automatically installed plugins here. And then you have this Learn tab where you can go to the Android Studio help, the getting started guide, Android Studio on YouTube, and so forth. So you can really learn a lot from here as well if you want to dive deeper into it and get a better feeling for it. But obviously we're going to go into most of it in this course. Obviously I cannot explain you everything that there is to know, but that's not the goal of any given course. I will, however, prepare you very well to build your own applications and get a job as a developer. So let's go ahead and create a new project to get an overview of the user interface. And when we start building a new project, we are greeted with this window where we can choose phone, tablet, Wear OS, television, and automotive. So you can see that there are many different areas where Android is being used. Okay, so we're going to fully focus on the phone and tablet side of things. So we're going to build applications specifically for phones. And you can go here and there you will see a bunch of predefined templates. So these templates, what they will do is they will give us a bunch of pre-written code that we don't have to write ourselves, but this makes our life a lot easier because this code is basically like the blueprint for a beginning application that we can then extend. So we can add to it. So you can see there's the option of an empty activity, a no activity, and so forth. The easiest one that we will start with and most of the time use will be the empty activity. All right, so let's just use that. Click on next. And then we give our application a name. And I'm just going to call this my first app. So my project will have the name of my first app now. Then there is this thing called package name, and every single app, once you want to publish it on the Play Store, has to have a unique package name. So that's something that you will have to set up later on once you want to publish an application, but this is not something that's super relevant at this point. The structure is always the same, com.example. And then the name that you entered here, you can obviously change that. So I could change that to eu.tutorials.myfirstapp because my website is called tutorials.eu. So you see the structure is a little different. So you start with the ending of a link or URL, and then you go to the domain name, such as tutorials in my case, and then you have the name of your project. So it says my first app here. You can change the save location, so where you want to store your application on your computer by clicking on this little folder icon and then selecting a different folder. I'm just going to leave it as default, so it's under users, admin, Android Studio project, my first app. Now the minimum SDK in the past has always been 4.4 and they have finally changed it to 7. So Now, when you're building Android applications, by default, they will be built so that they work on Android devices that have Android 7 or newer installed. So, for example, Android 14 is the latest version at the moment that I'm recording this video. So it's quite a bit of a difference here, quite many years apart, actually 7 years apart. So you can see that this app will run on approximately 95.4% of devices that are out there and that have Android. There are obviously some devices that don't have Android 7, that are older, or that are really specific hardware that is used for very specific things, like in warehouses or whatever, where they still use very old devices that have an older version of Android installed. But when you are aiming to publish it for the majority of devices and people, this will be totally enough. So the minimum SDK is the one that we're using here by default is API 24. So this SDK stands for Software Development Kit, which is basically a set of software tools and libraries that developers use to create applications for specific platforms, in our case for Android. Okay, so API 24 is the version, the Google developer internal number for Android 7. So you can see when you scroll up that you can select older APIs all the way up to API 21. So the first API was Android 1. Then API level 2 stood for Android 1.1, and it went all the way up to now where it is at API level 34, which is Android 14. So basically every single new official Android version that comes out gets its own API number. So you can see API 21 is Android 5.0, API 22 is 5.1, and so forth. And we're using API 24 as the minimum SDK, so Software Development Kit, which includes a bunch of features that we use for building applications. So you can see we can go all the way up to API 34, which is the latest Android 14 version. So once we've done that, we can go and finish or click on finish, and then it needs to unzip and install certain files. And once those files are done, we can click on finish. And this will then leave us with our little My First App inside of Android Studio. All right, it will also take a little while. You can see that here at the bottom where it still downloads the Gradle and it builds the Gradle. We're going to see what the Gradle is later on, but basically it just prepares our application so that we can get started with it. All right, so that's it for this video in which we have set up our first project and I gave you a little bit of background information. In the next video, we're going to look at the user interface.